February 9th, 1990, the United States made a quid pro quo deal with the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a good man. He is vilified in his country to some degree for being a good man. And I'll explain what I mean by that, because those are perspective differences. But I'm saying this more so as from the perspective that he took. He was being earnest. A quid pro quo was reached with the United States, and these are in transcripts. The U.S. will not expand NATO an inch westward, and we will allow reunification talks. Meaning, the reunification of Germany. We see Germany as a united thing right now. For the longest time, Germany was not a united thing. And when the Berlin Wall fell, it was somewhat of a shocking enterprise. Thing is, this is slightly, I was a kid at this time, but I do remember this being on TV to some degree, with these iconic images of people knocking down the wall. Gorbachev agreed to reunification talks with this notion that NATO, an organization that was built for the explicit point of either blocking or attacking the Soviet Union, would not move forward. The USSR eventually collapsed. One of the other understandings was that the United States wouldn't take advantage of what was left, meaning Russia and the country that was left. Well, that was blown out the window. They picked over the carcass of the Soviet Union, shock capitalism. A few people even went to jail over this, but hundreds of thousands of Russians died as a result of that. Not to mention the election where Yeltsin was essentially helped in by Bill Clinton, directly intruding into the politics of Russia at the time. They didn't want the communists to get in. Clinton thought it was perfectly okay to dump his people to help run Yeltsin's campaign. And Yeltsin, drunkard, sold out his country, won. His vice president just so happened to be Vladimir Putin, and they thought that Putin was going to be their guy, and now they're angry that he's not. I watched these impeachment hearings, and I watched these impeachment hearings with this look like, oh my God, these guys are in a different universe. And the media covers this in this splashy way without ever really giving context to the underlying questions that this impeachment hearing raised. In fact, they don't even raise those questions that the impeachment hearing should raise in a media that is informing its public, not just an American perspective, but a perspective that is in the best interest of the public so they can make an accurate decision on how they view international politics. I want to talk about the thing that matters in this, that gets ignored. Ukraine. I want to talk about the Ukraine. And I want to talk about this from a perspective of, if you were Russia, what is your perspective of the world? Not just in your area, but the world in general. How do you pursue and how do you perceive these things? If you, a person, were absolutely belligerent, cursing, drunk, and swinging your fists, do you think that other people around you would stay around you? How do you think those other people will behave around you? My point is, your country has a particular tenor. And when we look out at the world, we often drop the fact that our country has a tenor when we're looking at the behavior of other countries. Of issue here is Ukraine. Of issue here is Russia. Both of those things are being talked about in truncated ways. And I want to kind of expand this out a little bit. Let's talk about the thing that matters. The Ukraine. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. Even $1 helps. They demonetize all of these videos at this point. So as it goes, Donald Trump pressured Ukraine. Ukraine said they didn't even know they were being pressured. In a quid pro quo for funding versus information on Biden. They got their funding. They didn't know they were being pressured. And if they didn't get any information on Biden. And yet here we are. Many of the people who are talking about this are giving their opinion on U.S. policy in that region, as if their opinion matters. It's the president that sets the policy as foreign policy. That is literally one of his main jobs. This notion that these other people should matter in this, I don't understand why. Fact of the matter is there are a lot of people who disagree with Obama's drone program. It didn't stop him from murdering these civilians in this way, nor did it stop him from putting people in prison who revealed the fact that the drone program existed or that we were murdering people in those ways. I'm also weirded out by them not explaining the issue. NATO, as I said, the deal was made, and all of the links will be below. The deal was made that NATO would not expand eastward with this notion of reunification talks. That's true. That's a flat fact. This is NATO today. That deal was made in 1990. NATO expanded into all of these countries to gobble up countries that were once under the Soviet sphere. The United States, or let's say Western powers, wanted to make a deal with Ukraine. Ukraine was under the orbit of Russia. They were allies. And as you see, the allies in these regions are few, considering that NATO has expanded to the borders of Russia. This government was elected. No bullshit with the election. It was elected. It is what the public wanted. Despite what the public wanted, one of the deals that the West wanted to make with the Ukraine involved a provision that would have drawn it within the sphere of NATO. Ukraine said no. And when they said no, all sorts of hell popped off in the streets of the Ukraine. Now, this quote-unquote revolution, as it's called in the West, or this overthrow of an elected government that the U.S. and the West backed. Violent protests, essentially street protests, taking down the elected government. The West backs it. The West helps them out with resources. And not just that, this new government, this new submissive government, by the way, turns around and creates the threat of a Western government being involved in Ukraine. Meaning, if NATO or if Ukraine turned down the deal that would have drawn it into the sphere of NATO, and then there's a coup in the Ukraine at which the new elected government will take that deal and get within the sphere of NATO, you would have another major country on the border of Russia that is in an organization that is hostile to its very existence. Understand what that means for the moment. If one state in a NATO is attacked, all states are under attack, meaning all of these nations will have to kick into gear, and there are weapon systems and military in all of these countries with the notion of restraining Russia. But think about what that means from a Russian standpoint. If you're gobbling up nation after nation after nation, each one with a pact, that if one is attacked, all of them are attacked, then you've effectively created a hostile unit, singular unit of multiple nations on the border of Russia. Also keep in mind that from the historical context, Russia has been invaded by the West multiple times. 10 million died in the first war, 20 million died in the second war, with invasion forces going into Russia. They're a bit sketchy about their borders. And before you say, well, they shouldn't be because we're the United States and we're freedom and justice, hopefully you wouldn't believe that. Also, we've invaded their country once. Meaning we, us, when we tried to put back in the Tsar into power. My point is, we look at this in the West in a very particular way. And the problem is we don't look at it from the perspective of Russia. Do you realize that the United States was willing to go to nuclear war over missile systems being in Cuba? Cuba is not on our border, and yet John F. Kennedy was willing to end the world because of such. And we don't think Russia should be sketchy about their borders when we wouldn't tolerate the same? If Russia fomented a coup in Mexico and installed somebody who was in Russian interests and then started putting missile systems in Mexico, do you honestly believe the United States will sit there and tolerate it? Russia creates a counter-revolution in the Ukraine. The Crimea votes to go to Russia. What we don't often talk about is that the people who we were supporting were neo-Nazis. The government of the Ukraine and the aid that we were giving to them, that government was being propped up by various gangs, many of which were neo-Nazis. There's a picture of the Washington Post with John McCain standing beside a Nazi. Hurts. The upcoming neo-Nazi concert in the Ukraine that no one else is talking about. They've just named a street after a former Nazi. These are the people that we were supporting. When these people are sitting in Congress giving this weeping testimony about, oh, they need weapons, Obama would not even give them weapons. Obama wouldn't even give them weapons. Trump gets in office, and because of all the hysteria and everything else, every incentive in the world was for him to send missile systems to prop up the docile government of the Ukraine, or at the very least, that part of the Ukraine that the West was able to partition away and steal away from the other part of the elected government of the Ukraine. Prop that government up and put weapon systems in their hands against the other Ukrainian government backed by Russia. My question to you is, does Russia have a point to be a bit sketchy about what is taking place in regards to NATO, who's supposed to be there for the USSR? The USSR no longer exists. NATO continued to expand. And also the fact that they toppled the elected government of the Ukraine, meaning us and Western powers backing this, and then start sending them military assistance in order to kill potentially Russians. Obama wouldn't send those weapon systems for that very specific reason. And nobody at that point wanted the Ukraine in NATO because they understood that that would mean that every last NATO country would have to pop off. Despite the fact that the government that had partitioned itself, being powered by Nazis and fascists, didn't want those weapons and went running around begging other countries for those weapons. Trump sent those weapons. That decision was a lunatic decision. He did it anyway. This is Foreign Affairs Magazine. It makes the point that we assisted and backed a government on the border of Russia. And the elected government, we helped with the fomentation of a coup and then the propping up of the secondary government that split off from the Ukraine. All of this talk about impeachment drops everything that I just told you. And they just make the argument that the Ukraine needed our help. The Ukraine is the 51st state, 52nd after Israel, and that Donald Trump hurt the Ukraine so poorly and so badly against the Russian menace, that Russian threat, that he didn't send the weapons in a timely fashion. This is lunacy. That's the kind of point that I'm making to you. The Western media is giving you a story of America being the shining light. We're not the shining light in this process. And whether you realize it or not, this modus operandi takes place across the world. In Bolivia, there's documents showing that the coup leaders, the fascists that are in Bolivia, had talked with the United States and had gotten the backing of the U.S., begging for the OAS to do what the OAS just did. Invalidate the election without any evidence at all, any proof at all, with the OAS being paid for 60% by the United States. And the people who were involved in that coup being directly related or having ties to us. Fact of the matter is, they didn't need ties to us. They could see what was taking place in Venezuela and knew the perspective of the United States for somebody who liked Evo. And in the week prior, Bolivia has major lithium reserves. Those lithium reserves, there was going to be a Western company in Germany that was going to work with them to exploit those lithium reserves. Evo said no and instead went with the Chinese company in order to exploit and get a better deal for his country, his people, on those reserves. Now, with the Cold War that has taken place between the United States and China, with the people within that country, meaning right-wingers, landowners, the rich, the wealthy, the oligarchs in that country, because if you remember, Evo's perspective in this was to raise major number of people out of poverty. He did. He's like poverty in half. By all measure, he was a successful president. Not to mention he was elected by over 10%. He was majorly successful. Working with China, help the poor, use the resources of that country for the people of that country, and Western interests not being able to get and exploit the resources of that country. Not to mention he's an anti-imperialist. The same strategy is my point. Foment people who are right-wingers, the patsies of that country, have them not accept the election results, have them foment a coup, and the U.S. gives tacit approval. The same thing that they attempted in Venezuela. You have your patsy in the country, you don't accept the election results, the U.S. co-signs it and backs it. It was more invested in the Venezuela one, but that one failed. Ukraine, same thing. You foment a certain number of people who are pissed off. You back those people who are pissed off with resources and whatever else they need to make that work. And you give it approval. Western media will always co-sign it. Same thing in Syria. You get people who are pissed off and you foment that and help that out. In Syria, it was that much more violent, however. And again, even if you look at Hong Kong, the same strategy. You see this strategy play out in place after place after place after place. My point is, under the Obama administration, they took down the Libyan government. I mean, you don't even have to go back to Iraq. The outright destruction of Iraq, the outright destruction of Libya, the outright destruction of Syria, or at the very least tried to. If it wasn't for Russia propping the government up and maintaining the government, you would have had terrorists running roughshod over that place just like they're running roughshod over Libya. Bolivia is taken down with the assistance of the U.S. Venezuela was attempted to take down with the assistance. Honduras was taken down under Clinton. I guess my point is your country has been going around knocking down governments, not back 40 years ago, but current. And what was taking place in Ukraine was no different than what is taking place in many of the other nations, even though it may take a slightly different tint of character depending upon the factors on the ground. We fomented a coup in Ukraine. We wanted to put NATO on the border of Russia, despite telling Russia that we weren't going to do that. Now we're in Congress yelling at Trump because Trump was slow in giving missile systems to potentially kill Russians. They are in an alternate universe in this impeachment hearing. And I still make the point that I don't like this notion of Trump trying to get information on Biden. By the same token, I didn't like it when a submissive Ukrainian government was willing to work with the DNC in order to give information on Trump or Manafort. I don't like this level of nonsense that these guys are doing. If you want to take Trump out of office, you have an election next year. I gently put to you that the president sets the agenda. You might not like it, but the president sets the agenda. Donald Trump was elected, and in the same way that Obama could set his particular agenda, if Trump did not want to send those weapons to Ukraine, that would have been perfectly okay. He's the president of the United States. If he slow-walked it, if he gave it a quid pro quo, even with the quid pro quo, he is president of the United States. If you want to censure him for doing that, fair enough. But all of these bleeding hearts talking about these Nazis and fascists that are supposed to, that they want to help hold back the Russians. I hate to tell you in this case, the Russians are right in the situation, not us. And the last thing we should be doing is sending weapons to the Ukraine in this situation, or for that matter, even trying to get Ukraine to be a part of NATO. All of these things are fails. All of these things are fails. And none of these things are explained to the American population. Why does NATO even continue to exist? Why do they even exist? Like, share, subscribe. And by the way, the people who we were supporting in Bolivia were outright fascists holding ceremonies where they're doing salutes and whatnot. Same thing is true in the Ukraine. Look up who we are supporting in the Ukraine. Many of these gangs are Nazis. This is what we were using to prop up this fledgling government that Biden essentially held a quid pro quo aid package for. Nobody's screaming about that. Nor are they screaming about Obama not sending them weapons. But yeah, Trump. Yeah, Trump. Yeah, I don't pay much legitimacy to what is taking place here. But I did want to talk about it in a more long form way, so you have some idea on what is taking place in the Ukraine. This is not our orbit. I hope you understand this. And the perspective that the United States takes is very similar to the perspective the Austro-Hungarian Empire was taking in World War I. Notice I say that led to World War I. The Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't want competing powers, meaning Tunisian Gap, or Tunisian Gap is what they call it. We don't want anyone else to be in a situation where they can compete with us. But understand what that means. That means that any rival power that is coming up will be automatically at odds with the United States. We ran roughshod over Russia when we got a drunkard put in office. If you ask Gorbachev today, by the way, fascinating interviews that have been taking place, and they asked him about where Russia should be and about Putin, his argument was, A, he knows he was taken advantage of. He's bitter about that. He should be bitter about that. The U.S. fucked me over. 2, whatever he thinks of Putin, he thinks that Putin is necessary in order to hold back the night in regards to what is taking place on the world stage and the U.S.'s provocative actions around the world. It's not that he loves him. It's more so he finds him necessary for the benefit of Russia and to maintain its sovereignty. He was around when that country was taken advantage of. He was around when Yeltsin essentially gave over the farm. He was around when the hundreds of thousands of Russians died as a result of the quote-unquote shock therapy as their carcass was picked over. Russia's not wrong in this. If you're sitting on the moon looking at events and you're not stuck within the context of Western media, we would behave in similar ways to maintain the sovereignty of the U.S. And not just we would, we did when John F. Kennedy was willing to literally end the world in order to push back weapons from Cuba. We are literally surrounding their borders. And the Ukrainian issue was mostly, for the most part, about Ukraine and NATO, and trying to get the Ukraine in NATO in this kind of weird de facto way behind the scenes, despite the fact that the government of the Ukraine was elected to be in line in the orbit of Russia. We didn't like the results, and so we changed the government. We've been doing this around the world without being honest to the American public about the fact that we've been doing this around the world. The clandestine operations that were taking place in Syria, the clandestine operations that were taking place in Libya, the shadow wars that are taking place in Africa. This stuff is in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. Even Fox News covered weapons going into the hands of ISIS when Obama was running weapons in Syria. Mainstream media doesn't cover this, doesn't touch this. Same thing with the Ukraine. The fact that they're Nazis roaming the streets of the Ukraine, mainstream media doesn't necessarily touch this. They talk about it in just these truncated terms to leave out, we fomented a coup of a government that was more in line with Russia. Mainstream media is okay with that because they take an American perspective. Mainstream media is okay with what is taking place in Syria, with Trump stealing the oil, take a Western perspective. They're okay with what's taking place in Bolivia, an outright military coup where the military tells the elected president to leave without any investigation into whether or not the OAS, who is paid 60% by the U.S., is a legitimate organization in regards to analyzing the election results. It's aggravating. Even in Venezuela, they take the Western perspective that Guaido, who is literally a traitor to the country itself by any stretch of the imagination, is somehow the good guy in this process. Honduras, same thing. Hillary Clinton says it's not a coup, despite the fact that the military is escorting the president and deposes the president in his pajamas. They lie to you. They lie to you. They give you a story, dropping the context of the story so you can come to a very particular perspective that you yourself think you came to. Meaning you think you came to a very particular conclusion. The conclusion was driven just based on the framing of the story. It's not thinking in this process. You're being given a narrative. there's a difference. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.